All right, I'm going to talk about empathy a little bit and how it is that humans evolved this emotion that we call empathy. So, more broadly, though, I'm going to talk about the role that empathy plays in world peace, okay? And in fact, I'm going to talk about the role that it has already played in creating world peace and how it will play into world peace in the future. Now, if you are a pessimistic person, you might think I'm crazy. You might think world peace is impossible. Or maybe you're somebody who watches mainstream media all day and you are looking at all the ways World War III might start, and because of that, you're missing all the good things that are happening in the world. You're missing the overall pattern, okay? And that's kind of what I'm going to speak about. I'm going to talk about the overall pattern of human history, okay? I'm going to kind of look at the larger timeline and how it's playing out. And I'm going to use that timeline to kind of convince you to be an optimist rather than that pessimist. Again, if you're stuck in that 24-hour news cycle, you're probably going to be a pessimist because that news cycle is not reporting on all the good things. They're reporting on the worst things that are happening in that 24-hour news cycle. And they're trying to propagate fear for one reason or another. Now, let's look at that timeline, okay, that larger timeline of human history. And I'm going to provide an example to kind of summarize that timeline. So imagine that there are two primitive families, okay? One of these families is thriving, okay? This family is, they have a source of water. They have the skills needed to hunt and to gather food, and they have the skills to build shelter and to build clothing, right? Again, this family's thriving, and they have an abundance of resources. On the other hand, the other family is struggling. They don't have the skills that the thriving family has. They don't have the hunter-gatherer skills. They don't have a water source. They don't have a shelter or clothing, right? And basically, they're struggling. They're struggling to survive. They're struggling to meet their necessities. These two families are polar opposites, okay? Again, one has the skills and the natural resources to survive, and the other one doesn't. So, we're going to compare the two mindsets first of these two families. The thriving family is going to kind of be in a peaceful mindset, right? They have peace of mind, in effect. They know how to survive, and they have the ability, the natural resources to do so. On the other hand, the other family doesn't, okay? So they're not going to be in a peaceful mindset. They're going to be in a fearful mindset. They're going to be in a fearful state of mind nearly all the time, right? And what that fearful state of mind does is it kind of leads to fight or flight instincts, fight or flight responses. So, obviously, if there's a tiger who's creeping up on you, you're going to run, right? That's a flight response. But more broadly, if you're struggling to feed yourself, you might fight the neighboring family in order to feed yourself, right? So, well, let's just say that these two families happen to live about a mile away from each other. They don't even know about each other's existence until one day, the struggling family comes up upon the thriving family. That thriving family just killed a deer, and they're dragging the deer back to their hut or whatever, back to their homestead. And the struggling family sees this. What are they going to do? Well, that fearful mindset, their desire to preserve their own lives is going to drive them to perhaps they're going to try to steal that deer from that family, right? They're going to try to steal the deer from the thriving family. It's the only way they're going to survive, right? So, what do? They run after the family, and the two families fight. Well, what's going to happen here? Well, if we play out this fight 100 times, most of the time, the thriving family is probably going to win the fight, right? The thriving family is probably stronger because they are thriving. The other family is starving to death. So, the majority of the time, the thriving family is going to win. But some of the time, maybe the struggling family wins the fight. Or at the very least, maybe both sides, both families take casualties. Maybe the fathers kill each other, and the single mothers are left to provide for their children alone. Now both families are struggling, okay? Whereas in the past, when the thriving family had a father, that father was able to provide. But now that father's gone, the mother can't do it alone, so now both families, again, are struggling. This again, the outcome of this fight response is unpredictable. Okay? And over time, humans caught on to the unpredictability. They caught on to the fact that there was no guarantee that you were going to win the fight against the neighboring family. So what happens? Well, eventually, in order to avoid that unpredictable outcome, eventually the families develop empathy for each other. Eventually, the thriving family decides to share the deer carcass with the struggling family. Eventually, the thriving family decides to learn how to communicate with the other family in order to essentially teach them how to provide for themselves. Eventually, they show them where they get their water from, right? Eventually, what happens is both of these families develop empathy for each other in order to diminish mutually assured destruction. Makes sense, right? So let's kind of take this a step further. So these two families, they develop empathy for each other. They join together. Now it's not two families. Now it's a tribe. It's a group of families working together. Now, what happens? Well, eventually this tribe, they run into another tribe. Maybe those tribes fight for a couple more 100 years. But eventually they catch on. They catch on to that mutually assured destruction, and they decide to develop empathy for each other and work together. They perhaps had two different languages, and now they learn each other's languages, and now they can communicate with each other. Again, mutually assured destruction turns into mutual empathy. So we take a step further. This tribe becomes a big town. It was two tribes, now it's one big town. That town turns into a city. The city turns into a state. State turns into a nation. Okay, and just like that, we have reached the present. We are currently in the nation versus nation stage. And what we are witnessing is many of the thriving nations, they are developing empathy for the struggling nations. Why? Well, because those struggling nations, they might seek to fight the thriving nations. They might get a hold of some modern weapons, and they might attack the thriving nations. This is what the entire Afghanistan and Iraq war were fought over, right? Weapons of mass destruction were the Iraq apparently had weapons of mass destruction, so we invade Iraq because we feared what those struggling nations might have done to the United States, right? But eventually, we develop this mutual empathy. Mutually assured destruction leads to mutual empathy. What basically happens is our fearful instincts, our self-preservation instincts, develop mutual empathy out of necessity. The thing is that the technology that builds nuclear weapons, it's probably not really much of a secret anymore. The secret's out. So because of that, anyone and their mother might build a nuclear weapon, and in order to avoid some Middle Eastern nation nuking some Western nation, what do you got to do? You got to develop empathy for them, and you have to work with them. You have to perhaps cross those language barriers and learn to work together. This is the pattern I want you to see. It's not a pessimistic pattern. In fact, it's the opposite. We have basically been developing mutual empathy in response to mutually assured destruction for several millennia now. And we are just getting to the point where we can do it on a worldwide scale. And it's actually fucking exciting as hell if you think about it. It's something that we have never been able to achieve before, to our knowledge. And again, I think we should be excited about that, and we should embrace it. There's no reason to be fearful of your enemy, if you think logically, because what you're doing is you are developing mutually assured destruction. You're developing the possibility for mutually assured destruction when you act out of fear, when you surrender to that fight response. If we instead choose the mutual empathy, if we instead try to take care of the people who are struggling, we try to teach them how to harness or to harvest the natural resources to provide for themselves, what happens? Well, all of a sudden, the people who are hungry don't need to attack you and steal your food. They don't need to attack you to protect themselves. All of a sudden, we're living peacefully throughout the world. And the cool thing about it is that there were tribes of humans all over the planet in the past, and they were always at war with each other. The difference between then and today is the technology. And the technology has two implications. One, it makes it a hell of a lot easier to provide for everyone's needs. It makes it easier to harvest the natural resources and turn them into necessities. But it also ensures communication between the various tribes in the world, right? It ensures that two tribes don't remain isolated from each other for millennia, and then ultimately when they do meet, they can't talk to each other, so they just fight each other, right? The fact that what I look forward to in the future with AI, artificial intelligence, is some kind of artificial intelligence program that can translate my words into a different language instantaneously. That would remove the need to speak the same language, right? It would remove the communication barrier. And I think that technology is we're probably on the brink of that if we are not there already. But if we can manage to, again, provide for everyone's needs using our technology and learn to communicate using that technology, everything else solves itself. Again, the pattern to recognize here is that our fear of mutually assured destruction creates mutual empathy. And mutual empathy is the only path. It's the only path to peace. Otherwise, you just ensure a vicious cycle of war. And that's what we're seeing in a lot of places in the world. There's a lot of Middle Eastern nations fighting millennia-old religious wars. And those religious wars will only stop when the people realize that they're not fighting over religion. They're fighting over their inability to meet their necessities. You might be surprised, no matter how dogmatic you are about your religion, you might be surprised to find out that dogmatism goes away the minute you're not hungry, the minute you're not thirsty, the minute you're not worried about a bomb destroying your house. So, what does this ultimately mean? It means that you have to choose empathy. Anytime you are driven towards that fight or flight response, you're contributing to the vicious cycles. Ultimately, empathy, again, it's kind of like a downstream effect of fear. It's a development that stems from that fear of mutually assured destruction. It's kind of like, again, it's like a higher evolved form of fear. It's like a long-term way. It's a long-term solution to the fight or flight responses that lead to those vicious cycles. So, just wanted to give you that perspective, because I think a lot of people, they get caught up in the 24-hour news cycle, and they start to think that there's no way to solve the problems, there's no way to world peace, when in reality we're on like stage 9 out of 10 stages of world peace. Again, it starts family versus family, then it goes to tribe versus tribe, city versus city, state versus state, nation versus nation. We're like on the last step. We just have to understand where we are and how we got here, and then we need to embrace the method that got us this far. And again, that method is mutual empathy. So thanks for watching.